Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of the Biennial Coffee Chat. We are live today with three members of our Youth Congress for Sustainable Americas and our moderator, Connor Hall, to be talking about sustainability, climate action, and the implications right now in the time of COVID-19. At any point throughout this conversation, if you guys have questions from the audience, you're welcome to post on the video, and we will get to those questions towards the end of the conversation. But without further ado, I'd love to pass this conversation over to Connor Hall, who will be introducing our panelists and moderating the rest of this conversation. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you for all the work you've done to pull this group together and to host this panel this morning. So I'm Connor Hall, as Robin said, and I currently serve as the Director of Conservation Finance Policy and Advocacy in the Intermountain West for the Trust for Public Land, which is a large conservation nonprofit. And we work to create public money for land conservation and the climate, and for equity and access to the outdoors. And I've known of the biennial for a long time and been involved probably for the last, probably about 7 years. I was with Governor John Hickenlooper, who originally founded the biennial, and worked with him for a number of years. And the biennial was always one of my favorite things to work on and attend, and met fascinating people and learned a lot. And I'm so happy to see that it's still going strong even in these somewhat challenging times. So thank you for joining us on this pretty early on this Friday morning for a light and breezy chat of the climate crisis and the pandemic that we're facing. I think we'll have everything more or less solved in an hour. But in all seriousness, we have three really incredible, inspiring young leaders from across the Americas here with us today on the Zoom call. And they're all doing great work around climate and sustainability in their own ways. And, I think our hope is that we all leave this chat with some global perspective and some hope. And, to state the obvious, I think one of the reasons I was excited to host this panel was that both the climate crisis and the pandemic are truly inherently global in nature and can only be solved as such, with a global understanding and appreciation of what different countries and cultures are doing, and a real willingness to trust and collaborate. And so that's why I think these conversations are so vital. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our esteemed panel. Just pull up their introductions. And I have to warn you, they all have very long, impressive bios for being so young. So I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights, but I'm sure you can find more, I think, on the Facebook page. So I'll start with Cyrielle Noel. Cyrielle is a local Pathways Fellow and works for Oceanwise as a program specialist in Canada. She was born and raised on the river island of Jajagay, which is also Montreal in Canada. And she studied international development at McGill, and then went on to Radboud University with for a master's in science and urban and regional planning, and Cardiff University with a master's of science in European spatial planning and environmental policy. She also serves as a social entrepreneur, and has a had founded a program related to ocean literacy and waterway conservation. So thank you, Cyrielle, so much for joining us this morning. Second is Monica Ramos. Monica is one of the Youth Congress for Sustainable America's founding delegates and a global shaper since 2017. She has done a whole lot of things in a whole lot of different fields. So I'm glossing over a lot here, but She's currently working with Universidad Continental in Peru to provide knowledge and tools to entrepreneurs to help them face the new normal in the face of COVID-19. She founded Resto Zero, a social enterprise working, and sorry for my pronunciation or lack thereof, but a social enterprise working with researchers and small coffee farmers in Peru to increase their income through the upcycling of their byproducts. She has a master's degree in environmental science. She has worked as a sales analyst for one of the largest Latin American banks. She has a degree in industrial engineering and is just doing fantastic work down in Peru. So thank you, Monica, as well for joining us. And last but certainly not least, Victor Rajano. Probably screwed that pronunciation up a little bit, but I'm trying.
Victor. It's okay.
And Victor is a Venezuelan lawyer who's passionate about environmental law and social entrepreneurship. He is currently the director of CIMAS, CIMAS, a nonprofit organization aimed to promote and defend indigenous people's rights and the right to a safe environment in Venezuela. He was chosen in 2017 to participate in the Young Leaders of America's initiative, professional fellowship program, which is sponsored by the State Department. Has done great work there. And in 2018, he served as a delegate of the Youth Congress for the Sustainable Americas, the program of the biennial. And is doing great work in Venezuela around climate and entrepreneurship. So Victor, thank you so much for joining us. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into some of the questions. And the first question I wanted to ask was kind of around this idea of the new normal, as it were. What immediate behavior shifts and new normal activities are visible in your city? And this actually, and this will be a multi-part question just to make it tough for you all. And then also, what behavior changes do you hope will be long lasting? And perhaps what behaviors or societal shifts are you worried about the longer term implications, if that makes sense? So Victor, you're on my screen. Why don't you go ahead and get us started? Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Answering your question is a little bit tough for us because to speak about the current Venezuelan situation is extremely complex, considering that we already had been struggling with one of the greatest economic and political crises in recent Latin American history. Very dark humanitarian crisis that have been affecting us in the last years. And that has caused that more than 6 million people have already left the country in the last 5 years. So this pandemic has added like an extra layer of difficulty for all of us. And especially for the poor and underprivileged people, people who cannot work, people who don't have access to basic goods or services, especially healthcare, social security, or even opportunities to adapt. Well, and speaking about the situation in Maracaibo, the city where I live in, is very disheartening. Most people have complied with the mandatory use of masks. There are not many vehicles going around the streets, and businesses are trying to shift their models to an online-based model. But I think that's similar to what's happening in other countries and cities. The difference here, I would say, is that people that depended on a daily income or were informal workers cannot work anymore. There is less and uneven access to water, gasoline, gas, internet, or even electricity. We are still facing daily blackouts of 4 hours or more, especially in border cities. And the pandemic definitely made the situation worse for all of us.
Great. Thank you for that answer, Victor. Cyril, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can maybe touch on the work that I do within OceanWise. So, and maybe speak more to the latter part of your question. So with everybody being kind of in a unique position to not work, we're noticing a lot more community engagement and like people have more time to kind of render service for their neighbors and for their environment. And so with OceanWise, the work that I'm doing is we work with 40 ambassadors throughout the year to kind of create service projects within their local community. And twice a year, they kind of get together and provide service projects to a community within Canada. So unfortunately, they're not able to kind of get out into their communities and mobilize like on the ground. But we are seeing a lot of like unique just ideas like adopt a grandparent ideas that came from one of the ambassadors that I'm working really closely. And she's trying to engage with the local care home in her community in Manitoba. So we're just really seeing a lot of different kind of opportunities, virtual might they be, but also I think it's a unique opportunity for not just youth. I think that there's often an emphasis on pushing a culture of service via the youth, but now that adults and even older people have a little bit more free time, we're seeing more of like intergenerational strategies in terms of service to the environment and service to each other. So that's really positive and exciting.
Love that. Monica, any thoughts on this one?
Yes, well, just to give a little bit of context, Peru is, well, luckily we were not in a crisis before. We just entered a crisis with COVID-19. However, our economy is mostly informal, so also we are facing many challenges like Venezuela, but probably not as bad. Sorry, Victor. And thinking about your question about behavioral changes that I've seen in the last weeks, I think probably it's really nice that we have been in lockdown almost 10 weeks now. We cannot use cars, but we were still able to go to the supermarket or banks, like basic needs. People is using more their bikes. Which is nice. In Lima, where I live, there are not many bike infrastructure, so municipalities are kind of improvising. This is a change. I hope it lasts, and we move from being a car-centric city to a more like people-centric city. And another shift in changes in the last years in Peru, and I think all over the world, we have been moving forward from plastic, at least single-use plastic. And since we are now getting more like virus phobic and cleaning everything, like it has changed from night to like the next day. It's like everybody's now using single-use plastic because they use it and then they dispose them. All these gloves, masks, people is going crazy, and then sometimes you don't have place to dispose them and you can find them on the streets, which is also a hazard because you don't know if those gloves are contaminated with the virus, and also they are plastic. So I think one of the challenges we face as a society is how we make sustainable disposables that allow us to still be safe in terms how we handle food, how we protect ourselves, but also we don't damage the environment while using these materials.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So kind of building on this question, I think probably we've all heard this, pandemic referred to as the Great Pause, or, maybe the Great Reset. So I'm wondering, how can this disruption, as it were, help further the climate conversation? Does it present an opportunity that way? And, what are maybe some ways that you are helping further the climate conversation or strategies to do so? And Monica, why don't we go ahead and start with you? We'll just work back this time.
Well, I think yes, it's a great pause. I think in countries like Peru, and I think all over the world, it has made people realize or the how our system was not right. So how use because all the world was in lockdown, we saw actually clean air. Come on, we are human beings. Our right should be to breathe clean air, and why don't we demand that? So I think it has increased awareness of what it could be, which is really nice. My hope here is that we keep that image in mind and work toward and make decisions like what you eat today also impacts what. Come on, in the States you're having a shortage of meat, which is actually good because contamination has lower because of methane. So I think how in our everyday decisions and also how we elect the people that represent us, that makes the laws. I think we as people should have the power in our like ISO position to have an impact. And I think people is getting more aware of what the future could be. And yeah, and just they need to make the choice. And I hope we make these shows as a global community toward this.
Well said.
Yeah, I don't really, you said it so eloquently, Monica, but maybe one thing that I could just kind of insert into the conversation is that it's not necessarily the COVID that is resulting in the environmental benefits that we're seeing. It's kind of the COVID is creating a circumstance where we're forced to change our behaviors. And so I think it's very rare that in history we get the opportunity to kind of get some insight into what a potential change could precipitate. So I think in terms of global leadership and the people who are making decisions, this is a unique opportunity for them to see, okay, if we are going to try and prioritize the environment and put restrictions, let's say on flights or different types of things, we can see XYZ benefits. And actually in preparing for this panel, I was researching on some sort of marine issues, just because that's something that's close to my heart. And the last time that there was kind of this pause in terms of marine noise was 9/11. So they're noticing that the marine life is kind of reacting in the same way. And so I think going forward, building on these insights and actually creating shifts, more permanent shifts will be useful, I think.
Well, I will add, I agree with the two of you. And I think this new normal is the perfect time to reflect on the impact of our actions on the environment. And even though the global focus is on the pandemic right now, we still need to discuss and further conversations around climate change and sustainability. And I think that this crisis should teach us a lesson, and that is to not wait until the harm is done to take action. We should need to take a more preventive approach. And as humanity progress towards the next phases of this pandemic, I think we are still are facing the challenges that climate change are posing to us. So we don't have to take our attention away from that issue too.
Yeah, well said, all of you. And it's interesting. I mean, Monica, you kind of hit on kind of a key part of my next question. You all extrapolated on that, but just to parse this out a little bit more, obviously many news stories have been fixated on this idea of the, resurgence of the wild. We're, seeing the waters in Venice clear, and, you can see Mount Everest from Kathmandu and all these different things. And I guess the final piece of the question that I'd love an answer on is, do you think of this as problematic or perhaps a flawed optimism, giving people a false sense of comfort? I mean, when we have a vaccine, say, is everything going to snap back to the way it was? And are we going to reverse those changes, or, will we maybe have a window into a new path? what we can do collectively together.
I don't know who you want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, actually, go ahead. We can do popcorn style here. Anyone who has a thought right now can jump in.
I think maybe what I wanted to add to my last comment is I think it could potentially be like a flawed optimism. I think if we don't kind of unpack the eco-fascism that's maybe kind of brewing within those sentiments, I think that just kind of viewing this as the earth is rebalancing itself doesn't take that intersectional approach of like, okay, yes, possibly we are reducing our populations, but it's always the marginalized people or the people who have less privilege that suffer. So that's not what I consider equitable. And I think when we are looking at these issues, COVID, for example, or any global crises, we have to kind of lead with that intersectional lens.
Yeah.
Well, Monica, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Victor, please.
All right. Well, I believe that this idea of the resurgence of the wild is, in my opinion, not problematic. What I think is problematic is to think that our environmental issues are going to be magically solved, or that these changes that we are seeing right now are going to remain the same after the pandemic ends. So I think, as I said before, definitely our human actions have an impact in the environment. And today we have this opportunity to reflect about all the root causes that have led us to this particular crisis. And considering that most of those causes are linked to environmental impact.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think it's really hard for a society to change. Like, it's not logical. I think human mind is not logic. Like, we are logical, but the way we act is totally different. It's really hard to predict. Like, there's a huge field science working on that, how we make policies that actually work, for example, on making people change their behavior, and it changes from society to another. And I'm just thinking in the new normal and how countries now are starting to restart their economy with some regulations, like what are those things that we should change in the system right now that will have this impact? I don't work in policy, so I'm not sure. Probably Victor knows way better. I'm an engineer, but I'm just thinking in a way, for example, if the development bank will borrow money, lend money to countries like Peru, and in one of the little letters, it will say, hey, but if you're going to use this to subsidize companies, you cannot subsidize companies that are bad for the environment. Or something just like that. I think the big players like the States, developed worlds like above the Ecuador, they are the ones that are going to lend the money to countries like Venezuela, Peru, and all the countries that are being more impacted by this pandemic, just by the way we are now in where we are in our development. I think those are like the people we need to change their minds. So they force countries like us that we live in as a country and as people, we live more in a daily basis mindset. We don't think about, hey, yeah, how it's gonna be in 20 years from now. It's like, hey, what I'm gonna eat today? How do I make that my people don't die, not from COVID, but from hunger? So yeah, so I think the discussion there, it should be global, but I think it, and I think we were talking about this before, but which is a responsibility depending on where we are located in the world also. I think this, even though this is a global crisis, our responsibility, sadly, is not equal in all the fields, depending where we are.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at the pathways to development, the global north has had this long runway of development fueled by dirty energy, for lack of a better word, and and so I agree. I think we have to be clear-eyed about that reality that it has not been equal, and we have to factor that into the solution, and making this making up for how unfair it has been, and trying to make that right, in my personal opinion. So those were all great answers, and there's something Suriel brought up that I was curious about, in Peru and Venezuela, and it's this idea of that equity lens. Are the governments, in both of your countries, Monica and Victor, are they doing a good job addressing the climate crisis with an equitable lens? I mean, is there good support for say the indigenous peoples in Venezuela, and are they a part of that conversation in both of your countries? And I guess, Monica, you're on my screen right now, so do you want to go ahead and kick that off?
It's a really slow process, the way it has been, which I think why this crisis is good, because it basically shakes up everything and can speed some processes, like, I don't know, digitalization. We have in that it's like access to everyone, no matter how. Some other processes in this crisis have been left behind because of how the crisis is here. Like, just to put a little bit of context, Peru is not doing that well. So in terms of managing COVID-19, so now the whole government focus is how we solve this problem, like this health problem. But also, as I mentioned before, we have some root causes like informal economy. The government has issued some money, like bills to give to people, like universal to everyone, but it's not much money. It has not access, and the people that has been totally forgotten is indigenous people. It's really hard, and also it's not because probably they wanted to forget them, but they don't have access, at least in Peru, they don't have access to basic services like a bank. So if they're going to get money, how do they get the actual money if there is no bank nearby? Neither like health service. So what indigenous communities in Peru have done when this pandemic started is basically close their borders and just isolate themselves and see. They're located in the Amazon basin, so they get from nature their food mostly. So they have done this. Sadly, some communities have already been infected, and it's really hard for them to get health access. But it's really complicated, and moving zooming out in terms as a country, like we signed the Paris Agreement. So there has been many efforts from the environmental ministry and related NGOs and organizations to push forward the climate change conversation. Last year we issued the law for banning single-use plastic. But now in the face of the crisis, everybody's using that because also it's accessible and there is nobody there to control that because, police on the streets keeping people in their house. So yeah, I think it's complicated, as I was mentioning before, to have a environmental sustainability talk right now, where all the effort as a country is focusing on controlling the health crisis.
Thank you.
Well, talking about the situation in Venezuela, I can relate to pretty much what Monica just said about people in Peru, especially indigenous communities. I want to speak as a lawyer. Even though Venezuela has one of the most improved legislation when it comes to environmental rights and indigenous people's rights in Latin America, we are still so far behind the climate agenda. We are not complying with our international obligations and duties regarding our international agreements. And even though there are being some efforts done in those matters, in in practice, none of those regulations are being executed properly, or public policy is not being used to favor the most the underprivileged people, especially indigenous communities. And I think that we are still in debt with most of them, because as Monica just said, those people don't have access to basic goods or services. They are in great risk, especially in this time of pandemic. The COVID is a real danger for all of them. And if we don't tackle this situation properly, and then they are going to suffer the consequences. They always get the short end of the stick, I believe. And we need to keep speaking about this and furthering the conversations to raise awareness about what's going on here in all our countries in South America, especially.
Great, thank you. Suriel, anything to add on that, this thread?
Oh, but I think coming from a global north context, it's quite different. And I think, yeah, going forward in the recovery post-COVID kind of context, I think it would be like really useful for there to be more cooperation between the global north to support the global south in terms of climate action as well.
Excellent. And, I think I couldn't agree more. And I think that's, it's got to start maybe from a government level, or that has to be included. But that's one reason that things like the biennial are so important, building these relationships and that shared understanding. It's so great that we can have these type of conversations. So all of you are, it seems involved in one way or the other around entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. I mean, you all are entrepreneurs in your own right. And so I'm kind of curious what the role of social entrepreneurs in addressing the immediate needs and more creative solutions of this time are. How is entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurs, how are they showing up in this crisis in your country? And yeah, go ahead, Victor, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, I believe that when this kind of crisis arises, to creativity and innovation of entrepreneurs have to play an important role. And I think we all are out of our comfort zones, and this is like the perfect time to put all our skill sets and abilities to a good use. I see, for example, tech entrepreneurs trying to develop materials and medical protection using 3D technology and sharing their models to others in other countries to kind of facilitate that exchange of technology. So I see that already entrepreneurs are doing a very good job trying to overcome the most impending issues regarding the COVID pandemic. And I think we need to realize that this is the best opportunity for us to showcase our innovative side and design a path to follow for the next months. And even after the pandemic ends, the entrepreneurs, especially social entrepreneurs, have to play an important role.
I totally agree with what Victor says in terms that, like, I think social entrepreneurs are already like in this field of entrepreneurship because they like challenges. Usually, like in countries like in Peru or I'm pretty sure in Venezuela, social entrepreneurship serves or cover the services where the government is not doing their job. So meaning health, meaning food, meaning sanitation. And people going in this is crazy, because how you make money out of sanitation, for example, is quite difficult. But still, there are social entrepreneurs already working on this. So I think, at least from what I've seen in Peru, there are like two profiles of entrepreneurs. Ones that were already working with people that in somehow has been affected, and this crisis is actually helping them like grow the business, but more than the business, the impact they have, because they are helping already the communities they were working with. Somehow there were providers, there were suppliers or clients or whatever, but they were part of their community. So given that big organizations at the government does not have the power or all the information to reach everyone in the country, I think social entrepreneurs are being those links. And there we have the other side of social entrepreneurs that had to stop their business because now there is no business. And they're basically thinking other ways. So thinking about 3D printing, for example, I have some friends, three from different projects and fields that join together, and what they have done is articulate all the fab labs in the country, and they are like as a network now, getting donations, buy one get one free mask that they 3D print, and supporting local health personnel to get like the correct protection. I think it's really nice. In Peru, at least, social entrepreneurship of social entrepreneurs, the network is not that big. So I think it's easy to get to most of them. So it's easy also to articulate and see how it works. Yeah, I like the challenge part of the crisis, what it has to offer, like the crisis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think in my case, I maybe turned to social entrepreneurship when I was doing my activism work and just kind of wanted to create change, but not also suffer in my pocketbook. So I think that for me, social entrepreneurship, I see it as kind of like a way to kind of affect change and push the needle within the capitalist system. But naturally, entrepreneurs are problem solvers. So within my context here in Canada, there's been really cool initiatives of hackathons, and the topics have been so diverse, and a lot of good has come from that. It's difficult to kind of say what will be permanent and what will be long lasting in terms of the initiatives, but I think, yeah, social entrepreneurship is useful, especially in moments of disruption, but I think we need a three-tiered approach and also include not just the market, but also look at solutions based in the state and civil society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. And, I heard kind of this idea of the role of government versus, the individual or the entrepreneur come up a couple times in all of your answers. And it is a perfect segue into my next question, which is, what does the role that government versus the individual play in furthering climate and sustainability goals? And, how deeply is this tied to the culture in your country or the, economic or political structures? So Cyril, I don't think you've started a question yet. I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds great. I actually did a little bit of research because I've kind of been had my blinders on for the news because it gets a little bit, you get inundated with a lot of terrible news, but actually 3 positive initiatives that I came across. So at the national level, there's the LEEFF, which is an emergency fund for larger companies. And so the government is providing this funding for these companies, but in exchange, they have to produce reporting on how their businesses will impact climate change or positively impact climate change. So that's something really exciting. And I think in periods of crisis, you can kind of tie people into kind of fulfilling your agenda once the crisis subsides. So I'm really happy and really optimistic to see that at a national level, this is something that has been unleashed. And then I actually heard from a friend of mine who is benefiting from this second initiative. It's from our provincial government. So they're providing funding for business owners for them to kind of upskill their employees. And so I have a friend who is in tech and does all that kind of stuff, and he's benefiting from it and wants to do a coding program so that he can eventually do coding for more environmental initiatives beyond. So that's kind of cool. And then the third thing that's ongoing actually as we speak is the Sustainable Development Conference. So there's a conference that's going to be happening annually to kind of understand where Canada is in terms of achieving the targets. So the first one is happening now. And yeah, it's a meeting of all three spheres. So the markets, state and civil society. So really exciting things.
And are you playing a role in that conference, Cyril?
Yeah, so Monica mentioned she's a global shaper. I'm a global shaper in the Montreal hub as well. And yeah, it's as shapers, we're trying to kind of support this initiative and see yeah, how we can kind of get involved a little bit beyond this first meeting. So
Great. And will you just real quickly, for the people who don't know what global shapers are, will you kind of explain what that is?
sure, I can take a stab at it. I'm a new one. I kind of explain it as like the youth division of the World Economic Forum. So there's like so many hubs. I'm new to the Montreal hub. I've been in it for under a year. But yeah, there's different projects. I think the projects now are falling under 3 themes: equity and inclusion, employment and education, and climate change and environment.
Well done. Well done. Well, great. Thank you, Cyril. And Victor and Monica, do you have any thoughts on this question of, kind of the government versus the individual and the roles that those play in climate and sustainability?
Sure. I believe that a collaboration between the public and private sector should be the norm in these cases particularly. I think when it comes to sustainability or the sustainability goals, individuals and governments should work together to push the agenda and to achieve the desired results. In Venezuela, like I said before, we are really far behind on the issue, and I think the government have neglected its role into connecting with people or empower the people to find collective solutions to our common problems. So I think that people right now are more focusing on solving their own individual issues, not only because of the pandemic, but also caused by the humanitarian crisis. And people are not aware of what they can do to support the sustainability goals, or to even the most simple actions that they can do in their everyday life. And the people are really worried about the day-to-day life, the daily income. Like Monica said just minutes ago, people are worried about what I'm going to eat today. And they are not particularly focused on what is happening about climate change, for example, or what are the issues that as a country we're facing regarding sustainability. So I think the government have failed when it comes to finding the links with the people to really push these climate conversations or the sustainability agenda.
Well said. Monica?
Yeah, I would just add, it's I have a really personal opinion on what I believe the government should play a role. Like what I've seen all over the world in general is that usually people push for some change and then policy comes after, at least in some countries. In countries like Peru, where we have other players in our political atmosphere, is like people pushing, perhaps supranational organizations like UN or Development Bank, I don't know, also push some, and then the government, because everybody's pushing, probably I should implement this. But it's also, I think in Peru, it's also a huge role where that NGOs play, like Swiss NGOs, I don't know, there are the Dutch and this support we get from other countries, where in their agenda, like for example the Netherlands agenda and the EU, Canada's agenda is going to a more green development. So they also help, like the German also, they help the government implement these policies. It's hard, I think, for us, and I'm pretty sure Venezuela is the same. The law may exist. It does not mean that it's implemented, but it exists.
Exactly.
And there are also some private sector companies that, because they sell, they export, for example, some products, and they have to comply to some foreign legislation. They also ask their supply chain to comply. So then you can see also from the supply chain having this like domino effect. Some companies, because they really believe in sustainability, some others because, you know, if I don't do this, I won't sell, and so others because just greenwashing, as everywhere it happens. But I think it's a multi-side effort. I think at least in Peru, it's not led by just a specific entity. You may say the government, the people, or just one sector, but I think it's multi-sectoral effort, which is really hard because then you have to articulate a lot of interest and find common ground. And I think that's why also this kind of things are taking a little bit longer than in other countries.
Excellent, thank you. And you know, kind of building on that question, how do you all think how do you think climate policy will change in the post-pandemic environment? You know, what big policy changes are we going to see? And then also, do you think that we're going to see any, you know, changes, say, of regime? I mean, you know, in the States, for example, you know, we have an election coming up. This pandemic is certainly going to have an effect on that. There's a possible regime change. And so, you know, just curious on those two kind of, you know, political pieces. And Victor, maybe we'll get started with you.
Well, just as I said before, when it comes to climate policy, it's a very tricky situation in Venezuela because we have a set of laws that should design the path for us to follow when it comes to climate change and sustainability. But there's not a single effort being done in that matter. So I think that after this pandemic ends, Venezuela definitely should become more attentive when it comes to these issues. And even though non-profit organizations, the civil society are trying to push the conversation or are trying to raise those issues to the mainstream, the main concerns of us remains into economical and political issues. So we have to start to change somehow. And I think that this particular context give us a chance to reimagine what is possible for us to do in the future. And especially lawmakers, policymakers should take notes and try to take examples of other developed countries and even other countries in South America. We are trying to overcome environmental issues within their capabilities. So I think that is going to be a really tough road after the pandemic ends, but I am optimistic that sooner or later our country will have the change we need politically and economically, and hopefully that will affect also the climate agenda in Venezuela.
Thank you. Cyril, thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Victor said, like what we need is kind of like what I'm most interested in. Like, I think, yes, regime change is possible, but I think we need to start framing it as necessary. If we're to achieve the SDG goals by 2030, we kind of need to shake things up for sure. And something that prior to the pandemic was kind of happening in Canada that I wanted to share was that there was a lot of kind of activism and support coming for the indigenous populations who are fighting against some pipeline projects that are being proposed. So what has kind of happened with the pandemic is that that kind of action and activity has kind of been eclipsed, which is obviously understandable, but I hope that that kind of action and those pathways kind of resume and continue, and we don't kind of forget that we thought that this was an issue prior to the pandemic. So.
Thank you. Monica?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a political correct answer. That's it. Okay, but I'm just thinking in the context of Peru and countries similar in the region. I'm not going to Venezuela because that's something Victor is way more aware. But sadly, we don't have like how you say, politically literacy in terms of individual what we should look in our politicians to make decisions. And everybody is really short-term minded. So thinking from our political government people that is already there or that is coming, we have elections or should have presidential and Congress elections next year. It's in the last many decades we have chosen people that promise everything and only promise the stuff that they could achieve in the next 5 years. Because otherwise, you know that there is not continuity in the government. So you are not sure, like if you are going to, that's for example, why education is so bad here. Like nobody, because education doesn't show off in the next 5 years. You see that change in 20 years, in the next generation. So I'm really worried there because I'm pretty sure whatever is coming, it's more immediate results. And also because probably that's what we need. And this crisis is not only a health crisis for us, but also an economic crisis. Our development index has gone down really bad, access to education, like as a world, but I think more in developing countries like Peru, access to basic services and all of this. So I think the conversation in the next years is going to be how we recover. Sadly, like the conversation now, like thinking about, for example, enterprises, like they're asking money from the government to keep working. And the question the government is asking most of the time is not, hey, do you impact the environment for good or not? It's more like, how many jobs do you create? So if I reactivate your economic sector for you to start working in this quarantine, how many jobs are you going to create? And how many people are you going to protect? Like use your entire protection gear, which is all disposable. So it's a lot of plastic, but it doesn't care. Like you want to keep people safe. So I think it's a balance, but I think more now we have like a society more immediate needs that need to be covered before we start having this environmental conversation again. And that's why I mentioned before the role that supranationals organizations have, like Development Bank or all these organizations that are lending us money to activate all of this. Like, I think if they push for a more like sustainable reactivation of the economy, probably that can be done, but I don't believe it's gonna be people or the government pushing for that, but because someone is asking us as a requirement for giving us money or other resources.
Thank you. I certainly hear what you're saying about this issue of I guess political short-sightedness. I think that's a global issue, and it certainly plays into this climate conversation. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in, and we are very guilty of it here in America too. And I'll leave it at that. But so we have a great question from the audience here, excuse me, which I'll read now. So even as we are dealing with a pandemic, we have seen that special interests such as fossil fuel companies haven't stopped pursuing their personal interests in resource extraction. So here's the question then. How can the climate movement mobilize to push forward the climate agenda, even when people and government, even when the people and government's attention has shifted towards pandemic response? So Cyril, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think it's a ripe opportunity to kind of reset your economy and diversify. So I think diversity is the key for me anyways, to sustainability. So I think that the government is kind of understanding that we can't have such a focused, we can have so much focus on fossil fuel extraction, but the only thing that I'm kind of worried about personally, on a personal note, is that we know that things like the circular economy or like more greening our economy are kind of ways to create resiliency in our economic systems, but I'm not seeing that much happening in my national context, unfortunately, with regards to the sustainable blue economy, which for me is a big gap. We have the largest coastline in the world. I think that there's a lot of opportunities that can come from kind of investing, but it needs to be done in the right way. So I don't really have an answer to that question, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, real easy question. Victor?
Yeah, well, I can relate to what Cyril was saying. Venezuela has been dependent on oil for years, and actually our oil industry have become practically useless because of the mismanagement of the industry. And I think this is the perfect moment to diversify our economy, to think about other ways to find an income and to produce better goods and more sustainable ways of living. And well, answering the question, I will say that even though the pandemic is the attention or it's getting the attention that it deserves, because obviously it's a pandemic, it's a worldwide situation that is affecting everybody. But nonetheless, I think we still need to realize that there are other issues that need our attention. And climate activists, for example, Greta Thunberg, she has shifted her climate activism to her household and is still trying to push those conversations around. And I think we just don't have to stop our efforts wherever it can be done. We should do, for example, use social media or use our voices to reach out as much as possible to spread the word and keep this conversation going. This is so important. So even though the attention is all about the pandemic, we still have other issues to deal with.
Thank you.
I think I think it's about, like, when doing activism, it's also about timing. I believe in now, at least in countries where the pandemic is still not over, or at least we don't know when it's going to be over. It's hard to shift the conversation from health issues to environment, because as we were speaking, this is like environment is like a more long-term thing that we predict may happen, but actually we don't know when. There are all like algorithms going around. So I think from the civil society, I think we can use this crisis to show how things could be done, in terms like not moving, like if you look at the pieces of the puzzle, it's like not moving the government to reinforce, not extraction companies to extract, but shifting the market. Like, hey, we are now have restrictions of mobility, not only from goods, not only from like people moving around, but also goods. So cities that are so resource dependent from other locations in the world, now you have the opportunity to do city mining. Hey, look for your resources in your city, find new recovered plastic, may say biodegradable, price that in a competitive price. Like now you have a shortage of offer. So now is the timing to have like a high price. You can with that improve the technology, and when the supply comes again of cheap raw material, then you can compete with that. And I think now, like what I've seen, and I think this happened all over the world, I'm just changing a little bit example, but you used to use if you shop by internet before, you used to use the same like supply, like the same shop, like, hey, I will order always from this company. But now they are like, either they don't have enough capacity to attend all customers, or basically because of the quarantine, they could not operate. Then you had to change to new shops, new ways. So these small new companies had opportunity. And now you, like in my case, for example, I used to shop directly from the supermarket, but the supermarket now had an overload. They would deliver in 1 month, which is crazy. And so there was some entrepreneurs having this like Shopify or Shopee, I don't know, I think there's this app in the States that's similar, that you have people shopping for you in huge quantities. Yeah, I've never used the service. I love it, and now I use it because for me it's easy. It's in my home in 2 hours. If the pandemic hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't have used it. So I think this is an opportunity. I think it's not always the government pushing changes, but it's also us in creative ways finding new solutions for the same problem.
Well, great, thank you. You know, an hour has flown by here already, so we'll start wrapping up here. And I appreciate all those thoughtful answers. I always like to end panels on a high note, and I think you guys have done a good job weaving through a lot of hope and optimism in this conversation. But if in 1 or 2 sentences, just very briefly, will you tell me something that gives you hope or that you're grateful for in these times? And it can be big or small, just something hopeful or that you have gratitude for. So we'll go ahead and kick it off with you, Monica.
I'm grateful for technology. I think if this pandemic had happened 50 years ago, it would have been totally different. And technology in terms of keeping us connected, keeping us still being able to work and develop solutions that help to solve this pandemic without the risk of actually being together. I think it's great having these technological tools. I hope that this is more widespread, like that connection becomes like a human right also, like having access to internet or whatever form of connection, because we have seen in how education has shifted from an offline to an online world, which also means that a lot of people does not have access right now. So yeah, I wish this pandemic accelerates that path of connectivity for everyone.
Great, thank you. Victor?
Well, I'm grateful for change whenever it comes, because it always takes you out of your comfort zone, and it is when your ideas goes or your innovation comes through. So I think these particular times of change and these critical times are the perfect scenario for us to not only redesign our individual paths, but also to, as a community, see how is it possible for us to find common solutions or collective solutions to our common problems. So I think I'm very grateful for this opportunity and for being a part of this change that is coming for us in the country.
Yeah, amen to that. Cyrielle?
Yeah, so a couple things came.
Ooh, I think you may be muted. Ooh.
Yes.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I think just building off my last comment for the point about the oil industry and fossil fuels, I think that whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a climatic climactic event or whether it's the future of work, maybe things will be automated and there will be people out of work. I think that we need to kind of draw into the connection, this period of reconnection that is being offered, to kind of plan more comprehensive and more holistically going forward. So my background as an urban planner, they teach you in urban planning school that like cholera was an era where urban planning was kind of reimagined. So what gives me hope is that just even from a planning perspective, like this is just an opportunity to kind of think, okay, how can we make our societies more resilient and more robust to these shocks, rather than operating in the binaries like the urban and the rural, or indigenous and non-indigenous. Like we're all just people. And so I think that there is capacity to kind of just be more connected and create solutions that work equitably.
Awesome. Well said, all of you. I'm grateful today for conversations like this and for all the great work you all are doing around the Americas. So with that, I think that wraps up our panel. I'll kick it back to you, Robin. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Me on the background listening is really inspired by everything that you guys have to say and the opportunities right now to address some of these larger climate issues. So thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to inviting you to participate in a future coffee chat. So thank you and have a great Friday afternoon.